I wanted to talk today about a story that sort of blew up a couple days ago. Ethan Van Sciver, who is actually an artist on the Green Lantern series, and he's done various other things, especially comic book covers, so he is a veteran of the industry, who's worked with DC Comics for a long time, has said that if the 5G event, which is the next big so-called upcoming event from DC Comics other than the Dark Knight Metal, sequel, if that fails, that DC Comics will shut down. Now, you're gonna say, Jay, why do you think this is nonsense? Ethan Van Sciver's worked with this company for a long time. You're an outsider. What the heck do you know? Fair enough. Here's the thing, though. I have been hearing about how comic books as like an industry will shut down and fail since the 90s. Frankly, it was even starting before I was born, the talk of this. And I do want to go over some stuff, including just a breakdown of what Ethan Van Sciver said, what I think about it, sort of the state of the comics books industry now, and what I think will happen. So, Van Sciver, and a lot of this is from both Cosmic Book News and Bleeding Cool, which are sources that have a lot of, not influence, but I would say insight into the comics book industry. Ethan Van Sciver actually had said that sources in the comics books industry told him that if 5G failed, then DC Comics would be shut down. His exact quote, by the way, that's really being floated around is, "Understand, it doesn't mean the characters are going to go anywhere. Batman, of course, is a prized possession of AT&T now. AT&T is Batman," which, let me insert, AT&T owns DC Comics. "And they are going to keep putting out movies and products and toys and all that stuff. Comic books are dead, and they are going to close up the publishing house soon. I'll tell you that a professional who I spoke to recently said, yeah, I was talking to one of the higher-ups at DC Comics who said that if 5G doesn't work out, that's it. AT&T is closing the publishing arm. So this is ball game." So first off, let's just dissect this super quick. Here's my problem with this already. It's not even just that Ethan Van Sciver was talking to a higher-up at DC. No. What he said was that he spoke to another professional who said that they had spoken to a higher-up at DC who said this. So we're already playing a game of telephone here by at least 2 degrees of separation, which I think is always not a great way to start something when you say, oh, my friend told me that he heard this from someone else who heard this or whatever. That's not very credible in general, but it's still very possible. We're watching the end of DC Comics happen real time. 80 years of history. I can't believe it. If Didio is gone, which we'll get to in a little bit here, replace him with Jeff Johns or go out of business. Effing hate seeing this. I loved DC Comics. So, again, this isn't new. This is something that was spread actually last year. And Didio was the head of DC Comics for a while. And 5G was supposed to come next. This was going to be a reboot of DC Comics in a way, and also not. It's something that's been teased before, but for those of you who don't know what it was supposed to be, just a little TLDR of 5G coming in the future, was it was going to be a 5th generation of DC Comics heroes. The idea was to replace a lot of iconic heroes, including Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and The Flash, with new versions of those characters, at least for a while, but there were also hints that eventually that decision would be reversed, and that we would get the normal characters back. It's very rare that they phase out a comic book character permanently and replace them with a legacy character. In fact, it's almost unheard of. And that's sort of the problem that I have with 5G, and we're going to sort of get into that here today as well, because the idea that if 5G fails, the comic books industry is basically going to cease, and more specifically DC Comics, which would then be a domino effect because you'd have DC Comics fall, the only choice would be Marvel and independent publishers. Eventually, Marvel would decide, probably if DC Comics wasn't around, that it wasn't worth just the publicity for their movies that are self-sufficient at this point to keep the publishing arm going anyway. Then that would shut down. Then there would just be independent comic book creators. So the reason I don't think this is going to happen is because of the industry now. But I was looking at a lot of stuff in terms of the original comic book industry crash of the 90s. It's something that's happened before that even, where comic books really kind of hit a bubble, but the main one people remember was the 90s. So what I wanted to look at with that was actually what caused that and why that's very likely not going to happen again today. And frankly, as far as what caused it, there have been like a lot of different takes on that, but really a lot of it is just to break it down simply. In the 90s, comic book purchasers and speculators lost interest because there was so much supply. There were so many different titles going at the same time. There was just so much that it couldn't keep up with the demand. The demand was less than the supply, and instead of realizing that, comic book companies kept like flooding the market with comic books, and it eventually hit this point where there were so many of them that there was no way to sell them. This is very similar in games. If you remember the idea of the AT game for Atari, how they actually produced more AT cartridges than Ataris that existed at the time of their production. Like, it's just companies not understanding supply and demand. And if you are a company in any country in the world, that is the fundamental rule you need to understand. Comic book companies didn't get it, and the comic book industry almost collapsed. But they bounced back. One main resource I used to sort of research why the comic book industry of the 90s really crashed was this website called comicbooked.com. It's a website I actually really recommend because they actually talked a little bit about this and sort of provided a lot of detailed background on it. But the part that they get to that I think is really fascinating is why comic books are safer today in today's market than they were. And there's a few things they touch on and a few I will as well. And this also comes partially from a Harvard economist, so they do get people to actually back this up that have credibility and credentials, since that matters to people. And part of the reason that comic books are safe today is because they actually understand supply and demand. I think I can break that down really quick because Marvel is obviously, like they say in this article, it's owned by the Walt Disney Company, and DC Comics is now beholden to Warner and AT&T, and those are making a lot of money off of films. Marvel's making tons off their MCU, and while not nearly as much, trust me, DC's making money off their movies. Like, the amount of money that they made off of something like Man of Steel, BVS, and even Suicide Squad, it was pretty big. And now maybe some movies like Justice League and even Birds of Prey fell a little flat, but Shazam soared high. Joker was insane compared to the amount of money that went into it. $55 million, I believe, to make over $1 billion. That's insanity. These are characters that make money. And in fact, they make so much money that the amount that gets poured back into the comic book industry is like a trickle of the film profits. It's not even hurting them to run the comics industry at a loss, because that's just free advertising for the movies. I mean, think about it. You're really passionate about Batman. I'm going to assume you are, because that is the best performing videos on this channel by a landslide. I'm going to assume you're someone who likes Batman. Now, yes, you don't want to read only Batman. You don't want to only see that. But if you're passionate about this character, the fact of the matter is that between movies, which are years apart, between games that are years apart, a large portion of you are still going to read some comic books. And that's going to build that interest and keep that hype for the next massively selling product that they're going to push at you. And you might not like that. You might not like being talked to like a consumer, but that's what it is. The comic books have become the advertisements for the shows, for the movies, for the Funko Pops, for the toys and collectibles, for everything, the video games. These comics are the ads. They are the commercials to you. Now, some of them have fantastic stories like Doomsday Clock, please read it, but it doesn't change the fact that they are used as a marketing branch for these films. So now that these films are the focus, which is also arguably why many characters have been retconned to fit more closely with the films, Guardians of the Galaxy looking at you in Marvel's comic books, they don't have any reason to cancel these things. There's also a lot more variation, like they point out in this article too. Like, there's so many more independent comic book companies and comic book publishers putting out things that are interesting and unique that if you... And finally, I think also the fact that the internet is really just taking over and has for the last at least 15, 20 years in terms of sales of anything, I think that really does help the comic book industry. I mean, you have so many easy ways to get things now, like Amazon and Comixology, and frankly, even though I don't think it's mentioned in this article either, because I use this for sources, not just to rip everything they said, another actual example of something that works is something like the DC Universe application. The fact that you can get a membership to DC Universe and then get access to all these comic books as well. It's basically like a Netflix subscription for shows, movies, and comics. And they can sort of use that to just put out more content at, believe it or not, a relatively low cost. Comic books do not cost that much. You have many people who have their hands in it, but you have things like keeping up the copyrights and trademarks. You have things like the artist, the pencil, so there's several artists. There's the penciler, sometimes the inker, and those people can be the same. They're often different. One will draw the pictures, sometimes one will do the shadows, or they'll be the same person. You have the colorist who will actually come in and coloring the panels. You have the writer, which usually there's more than one. You have editors, but at the end of the day, compared to a movie, there's like maybe 20 people working on a comic book versus like thousands, like 1,000 people working on a big AAA movie, a huge industry movie. Like, there is very little investment to keep each of these books going. At the same time, I think it is silly for us to sort of just say that nothing's changed. I mean, if you look at the sales of comic books, I'm using a site like comiccron.com. This is a site I use to look at comic book sales because I'm a huge nerd. And you look at the difference. I'm looking at the difference between actually the month of, I believe, December 2019, so a couple months ago, and looking at the difference between that month and January 1998, sort of after comic books had been coming back on the rise. There is a huge difference in terms of sales. Now, the top selling of that month, of 1998, of January, that was actually Uncanny X-Men. It sold an estimated 154.4 thousand units, so 154,418, whereas the top seller of the month of December 2019 was actually Doomsday Clock number 12, which sold only 117,000, but about 118,000. So there is a very big difference there of about 30,000-ish, 30,000-ish, give or take, 35,000 sales for the top slot. And also you have a bigger fall off. I mean, you have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, actually, wow, you have 9. So you have the top 9 titles of January 1998 were above 100,000, whereas only the top 2 of December 2019 were above 100,000. And then you have quite a few hovering around there, 90,000, 88, 74. So there is a difference in sales, especially in these 2 months, and it's a trend that we have seen. Another trend that I think is concerning is the fact that so many comic book shops have shut down, and there is also estimated thresholds, and I couldn't find exactly where this estimate was from. So if you find it, please let me know, but there was an estimated threshold idea that if comic book stores in the United States fell between, I believe it was between 1,500 and 1,400 still operational stores in the country, that it would no longer be worth it to distribute comic books physically. And it would likely still happen as a niche thing. We've seen this with movies, but that was sort of an estimate I've seen floating around too. But it's hard to organize thoughts on this. Frankly, I don't think it will happen because of a few things. One is obviously, like we talked about, with the internet, with digital comics, with accessibility to comics, with more variety, with a more stable market, even if it's smaller. But I will say that Dan Didio being fired, because Bleeding Cool has reported that he was fired from DC Comics, is both not a good look for the stability of the future of the company, while also not a good outlook for Generation 5. So what's the deal with 5G? I just want to go over this really quickly. The idea was that these heroes would be replaced by legacy heroes. And why would that... Well, first off, why would that happen? Who knows? Because comic book characters and go through changes like the wind, like the seasons. And there was a lot of discontentment reportedly within DC Comics with this, especially with writers like Scott Snyder, who apparently pushed back on wanting, I guess Dan Didio wanted the Dark Knight's Metal sequel to be connected to 5G and sort of start it. And Snyder didn't want that at all. Apparently he pushed back against a lot of the decisions from Didio. At least that's what's reported by Bleeding Cool. Because the idea was that eventually Jonathan Kent, the son of Superman, would become Superman. Luke Fox, who's currently Batwing, would become Batman. There's some others here. Captain Cold Jr. would be the new Flash. There would be a new Green Lantern. There would very likely be a new Wonder Woman from what I can tell. And the older characters would be aged up a lot. Here's why I don't think that this is going to have an impact on DC Comics living or dying, even if we ignore everything else. I think DC Comics has proven in recent years that they are a company who mostly understands business. Whether you hate or love their characters, whether you hate or love their movies, most of the things they make do fairly well, especially in the movie industry. There have been very few flops, and while they might not have the hold on the market that something like Disney and Marvel have, with their series, DC does understand business, and they do understand supply and demand. They've done a lot to meet supply and demand in the comic book industry, and they've made mistakes with things being delayed like Doomsday Clock, but the high sales of Doomsday Clock, they do show that people still have an interest in DC Comics. And we've seen this before in Marvel Now. We've seen a full relaunch where it sort of replaces tons of characters with legacy heroes, which are heroes stepping in to fill the shoes of a previous character. And very few of them have stuck. Very few. We had Miles Morales in the Ultimate line. He's one of the few that stuck around permanently. There's very few that have. Jane Foster has as well in a different form, but most of these legacy heroes eventually either step down out of that light, or they're killed off, or they're just written out. There's very many ways that the comic book industry gets rid of them. You can even think of like the New 52 with Gordon's Batman. I loved it, but there was a lot of pushback to it, and eventually, everything switches back, even if that was the plan all along. This is something we've seen time and time again, and frankly, I don't think that DC Comics would be stupid enough to rest their entire business on a Hail Mary, to rest their entire business on 5G, especially now that Didio's gone. Because Didio was the one pushing for this direction. He was pushing for the 5th generation and to shake things up. Even after the very poetic close of Doomsday Clock, which tied together a lot of eras of DC Comics. They wanted to shake things up again and cause a big stir again. And I think that this constant use of events is a little tiring for the consumer, for sure, and it's a weird thing to rest your entire business on with such a controversial one of replacing everybody. I mean, even if you look at these replacements, Luke Fox? Batwing, really? He's not really built up as a Batman replacement. Not really at all. In fact, those two characters don't even have that much contact in the comics anymore. They will cross over occasionally in things like Detective Comics, but for the most part, Luke Fox is off doing his own crap. So is Batman. Jonathan Kent is at least built up to, in terms of being Superman's son, and sort of having some sense of solid writing behind him. There is stuff there, but like a lot of these don't make sense, especially for this to be the last hurrah for DC Comics. I really think Van Sciver is off base. I believe he believes what he's saying, but I just don't believe this is going to happen at all. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think DC Comics will live to fight another day? Do you think that they will continue on and live? Or do you think that they actually will die off? Do you think that this is not a boy who cried wolf situation? That the comic book industry is finally seeing its end, despite the fact that we have all these other venues and interesting ways to consume comics now? Be sure to check out the Discord, where you can join together with a community of gamers like you who love comic books, video games, shows, everything in between. We love everything and everybody, guys. Make sure to check that out. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, check out the Patreon and the Reddit. and we'll see you in the next one. Have a fantastic day, and stay awesome.